Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Sidama Duwancho Red Honey Processed Ethiopia from Clarimento. And there's the box right there. And Clarimento, based out of Seoul, South Korea. And this is part 6 of our 7-part series featuring the 7 Korean coffees from our most recent blind taste test rankings video. And if you watched that video, then you saw that this coffee finished 2nd place out of those 7 coffees on that day. And I did say going into that video that this coffee was probably the biggest wild card, as it was the only non-washed coffee on that table. And for that reason, its placement was very interesting, as this one did turn out a fair bit cleaner than I might have expected going into that, but it was definitely pretty detectable given that the other coffees on that table were washed coffees. But we will see how this one performed by the end of this series, as this right here is day 47. And recipe we went with for this coffee, actually let me double check, it was with the Chemex. Recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So even with the difference in processing, you can tell that this one was notably lighter than some of the other coffees in this series, most distinctly those Hocus Pocus and that Felt coffee. And even then, it was lighter than one of the coffees that we had from John Small. So it kind of falls within that range, as I've kind of mentioned that none of the Korean coffees in this series are overly light, but this one skewed relatively lighter than some of the other ones. But even then, it kind of falls into that light medium in terms of that roast profile category. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 25, first impression, and it was the blind taste test day. And while this coffee did stand out as being the lone non-washed coffee, it's not necessarily offering heaviness associated that can be associated with honey processed coffees either. It was relatively clean in the sense that it had a very well-defined darker stone fruit sense in the finish, and obviously that ever so slight intensity was what did set it apart from the other coffees on that table. And usually it's some sort of fermentiness, funkiness, any sort of non-clarity that seems to stand out, but the one that really stood out about this coffee was just this intensity. So very interesting first impression of this coffee. We move on to day 26 as we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee definitely had a little bit of funkiness to it relative to the first try, but it does remain clean for a modern honey processed coffee. Plenty of darker fruit intensity, skewing on the slightly more berry side as well. So it's been a pretty nice start, especially from these first 2 tries. We move on to day 29 as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup is not quite as good, as it did feel a little bit more subtle, though it's still offering above average clarity. The profile of the coffee is pretty direct though, with a little bit of herbality, florality, and the darker stone fruits as well. So it's been a kind of interesting first couple of impressions. I think it left a very positive impression on that blind taste test because of just how different it was from the other coffees. And as you've probably noticed in this series, trying these coffees in a much more isolated setting has definitely allowed me to experience a little bit more from these coffees in that setting. This one was very much in line with that, and these first 3 impressions have been somewhat mixed, but that's actually going to change. As on day 32, we opted with the V60 with lower extraction adjustments, and this also led to mixed results, as the cup has a certain charm to it with a very notable dark stone fruit aspect that's pretty well defined and pronounced. There's also a spiced savoriness in line with the listed floral components and tea-like qualities. It's been very direct, it's just something a little off about this coffee. Day 35 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this is when the coffee somewhat flipped a switch, as this was by far the best we'd experienced of this coffee. I would say that it had a notable, almost strawberry jello-like aspect to it. More of the dark stone fruits in a lingering sense, with a little less of those herbal qualities in place of a much more prominent fruit aspect. Notably more clarity too, so a very nice day. It just seems once it hit this week 7 mark, the coffee just seemed to turn a lot. Day 38 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and even though it's slightly heavier than the previous experience, it was still relatively clean, especially compared to some of the earlier experiences we had. The cup offered a slightly spiced herbal quality yet again, but the finish does redeem the rest of the cup with that strawberry jello-like sweetness. Very nice yet again, and I just couldn't necessarily explain how this coffee just suddenly shifted as much as it did. Day 41 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and I definitely settled on the Chemex as being our preferred brew method for this coffee, as it has better definition to the flavor profile. Very clean for a honey processed coffee. I do have to say that, as the red themed profile remains very pronounced with terrific clarity. The slight herbality continues to remain present within it to complement the rest of the cup, but outside of that, I've kind of skewed away from discussing the fruit components because that's something that was very strong and pronounced within this coffee, and it's something that we're probably going to discuss a little more throughout this review. Day 44 through the Chemex and one final cup with more consistency, as it does have a surprisingly nice fruit-forward aspect with that darker red and purple tone to it. Plenty of strawberries and plum in a notably more clean sense. And that's not something I say a lot these days, is a cleaner strawberry profile to this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have quite a few level 4s. We will actually start with the finish level 4. And the finish is maybe one of the more interesting parts of this coffee because it has such a strong fruit forward profile that even then the finish just offers something a little bit different, that's slightly spiced and slightly more savory finish to it. That I think they have a listed black tea note listed on here, which makes a lot of sense. But outside of that, the finish just a little different from the initial profile that you experience from this coffee. Sweetness level 4, and this sweetness comes in a very strong and intense fruit sweetness. So I'm very happy with the way that the sweetness came out because it goes together with one other note that we're going to discuss at the end of these level 4s, but very wonderful and strong purple and purple and red fruit sweetness present within this one. Florals level 4. And they do have a hibiscus note listed on here, and that one definitely makes a lot of sense given that there is a little bit of that herbal tone to it and plenty of florals as well. But by the end, I would say that that's actually a tertiary tone to a lot more of the prominent and pronounced fruit aspects within this coffee. So we'll move on to those right now, starting with the berry fruit level 4. And it is interesting to me that they don't have any sort of berry note listed on here, but for me, I could say that this one tasted about as clean and defined of a strawberry gel-like attribute as I might have experienced from any coffee that we've reviewed in a very long time. So massive credit to them on that. It's just interesting to me that it's not on there, but outside of that, I would say that it's just very sweet and very intense in that regard. Stone fruit level 4, and that's the other thing, the red plum, they have that listed on here. And going into this, I was kind of curious how that might translate into this coffee. On paper, looking at this coffee, I probably would not purchase it if I wasn't going to include it in this series, mostly because having these plum, hibiscus, black tea-like notes on a red honey processed Ethiopia is a little bit of a red flag for me, and that's why you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, because even though it had all of those notes, they were present in a much more clean sense. And for that reason, I'm very happy with the stone fruits being there at that level 4, because even though peachy stone fruits are my favorite stone fruits, when I am getting a very clean and well-defined plum-like attribute in a coffee, I am almost equally as happy with that stone fruit aspect within it as well. Then we'll move on to the big and probably most important thing in this entire tasting wheel right now, the cleanliness, level 4. And if you'd have told me by the third cup of this one that it was going to score a level 4 for cleanliness, I would have been extremely surprised given it had some early up and downs. But by the end, I would say that it was just so clean and well defined, especially for what this coffee was, that I couldn't help but put it at that level 4 mark. It was one of those coffees that had the cleanliness of a wash processed coffee, but the intensity of a natural processed coffee. And those always end up being some of my favorite coffees of the entire year. And this one definitely had both of those things in abundance. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee. Don't think that this one was ever intended to be the brightest coffee out there. And then the other thing is the savoriness, also there at that level 4 mark. And as mentioned, they do have that black tea note list on here. I didn't know how that was going to translate into a coffee like this, but it translated well given that it was a little bit more present in the finish, and it just kind of gave this coffee a little bit more depth and character to it, as opposed to being maybe just overly fruit forward, which I wouldn't have complained about. If anything, I would have preferred those fruits to remain a pretty consistent and lingering aspect within this one. But I'm happy with the savoriness also being there within it. Once again, just a little bit more to this coffee. Final thing worth discussing, body, level 2. And as I've kind of mentioned, I was making a lot of these tasting wheels side by side in this series. So having this one with some of the other coffees I said just has a relatively lighter body than the other ones. The Chemex could have been a little bit of a factor at that. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, So my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one, out of all the coffees, I have to say is probably the one that exceeded my expectations the most, because I thought this coffee could go one of two ways. I thought it was either going to be a mostly passable non-washed Ethiopian offering that we had on here, or it was going to be, I would say, maybe a little bit too heavy, and some early signs indicated that it might be a little too heavy. And given I had no idea what to expect from the roast profile of a roaster that I had no familiarity with, it was really such a huge mystery and wild card as to what this coffee was going to turn out to be. And as indicated by the initial notes of this coffee, it was mixed, and I didn't necessarily have the best impression of it. But that week 7 mark, that seemed to just shift this coffee in general to a point where it was very much in line with what I want from a coffee like this, really seemed to help it a lot. This one was very nice, and it's one of the most enjoyable coffees that I had in this series by far, and definitely one of the most enjoyable Korean coffees that I've ever had. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you are looking for your cleaner, more processed coffees. I mean, Red Honey Processing isn't the most processed coffee out there, but it still offers plenty of the intense aspects of a non-washed coffee while offering the clarity of a washed coffee, and that's something that I always seek out. And then in addition to that, the very nice cleanliness and definition to the fruit profiles in this coffee do seem to help, especially given that they were coming in a very sweet manner. Complement that with a nice bit of savoriness and some floral and herbal tones to it, then you get something that isn't necessarily too one-dimensional, still straightforward, still interesting, still intense, and still plenty to it. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And it's right here is my review of the Sidama Duwancho Red Honey Processed Ethiopia from Clarimento. Thank you for watching.